Hi everyone, and welcome to the first in our series on the minor prophets. We've called it Here Come the Prophets because in the 12 minor prophets we see the increasing number of prophets that came to both Israel and Judah during the turbulent years before the coming of Christ. There was actually a prophetic silence of 400 years once the people of Jerusalem were returned from Babylon to the city. But in the period 400 years before the coming of Christ, right back to the beginning of that millennia, huge numbers of prophets were deployed. So we see 12 minor prophets. They're called minor, not because they're unimportant. They had tremendous importance, but their books were very small. And in the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, this is just one book. So I want to take you to a brief overview, and I'm going to give you just the briefest and quickest of overviews of what we're doing in this PowerPoint presentation. It is really difficult. I've found it difficult over the years to keep my head around what actually went on during this period of time. Because what we have is we have a divided kingdom. We've spent so much of the Old Testament going through the desert and creating a singular nation of Israel. And before you know it, the whole thing's falling apart. And it's probably significant for us to have the time frames in our heads when we're reading the minor prophets. Now, the other thing that happens is when we're reading the scriptures, we often sort of plod through thinking that it is subsequent, one story after another, that they're all clearly related on the timeline. And that's not the case. You really have to dip back into the Old Testament stories, both in Kings and Chronicles, in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of the other major prophets, to get the minor prophets into perspective. So if you have a kind of framework, which I want to give you today, and you can get this framework in your head, it'll make the reading not only more meaningful, but it'll give you a greater depth of understanding, a depth of enlightenment, because these books are so rich. In fact, in terms of prophecy, they contain many layers. So many of the verses that we draw out of the minor prophets that are really precious to us because of the messianic content, in their own day and in their own context, they had an entirely different meaning, equally precious to the people at that time. And so the minor prophets, for all of the judgment that we find in the minor prophets, we find great and precious promises. So this story really begins in 1 Samuel 8, where the people of Israel ask for a king. Now, why did they ask for a king? Well, they were really disappointed in the leadership that they had. And the nations around them had kings. And, you know, we always have a bit of what the Americans call jonesing, which is, you know, looking at our neighbours and thinking they've got something better. And so it starts in the time when Samuel was prophesying. So Samuel was both a prophet and a judge. He'd been brought up in the temple by Eli, and Eli's sons had turned out to be a real disappointment. And then, of course, Samuel's sons turned out to be a real disappointment. And when the people said, "Give us a king," Samuel went to the Lord and said, "What am I going to do?" And the Lord said to them, and you need to go and read the story in 1 Samuel 8, verses 5 to 7, but read all around it. You'll get caught up in the story. And the Lord said to Samuel, "They're not turning against you. This is not about you. This is about me. They're rejecting me. They're rejecting my covenant with them. Give them a king." And so Samuel went back to the people and he said, "You can have a king, but this is what a king is going to do to you. A king is going to take from you. He's going to take everything. And a king is going to make you. He's going to make you his slave. You're going to be a workman. You're going to be a workhorse. And you're going to lose your freedoms." And the people said, "No, we don't care. We want a king." And so the first candidate was Saul. And once again, you can go in and read the story of Saul. And what a disappointment he was. He looked like a likely candidate because he was tall, he was good looking, and so Samuel set out to anoint Saul. At the same time, David, I think, I don't know the exact years between these events, but David was out in the field looking after the sheep. He was just a boy. He was an unlikely candidate, but God saw something in his heart. Now, let me say immediately that David was the only king that really scored any points in the kingdom of God. He was a man after God's own heart. He was not a perfect man. He was a sinful man. He was a man who did his own thing, particularly with women. He let his family down in many ways. He wasn't necessarily a good father, but he was a leader that people followed, and he had a heart for God. His son Solomon followed, and Solomon was given the privilege of building a temple for God. David wasn't permitted to do that. He had blood on his hands. And so Solomon was permitted to build a temple. And at the beginning of his reign, he was a wonderful king. He prayed for wisdom, and God gave him a lot of wisdom. He gave him enough wisdom that he grew wealthy, admired, and people from all the nations around came to pay homage to him, and brought him gifts. He became wealthy, and then he became greedy. And then his lust for women got out of control, and before we knew it, we were in real trouble. There were two men that were vying for his kingdom. They were Jeroboam, who was a servant in his household, who had had the favor of Solomon for a time until Solomon began to recognize that God was about to use Jeroboam in some way. And then there was Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was certainly not a godly man like David. So you can read the stories of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and the story of Jeroboam's rebellion in 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 26, and all of the verses around that. It's a very interesting story of the way that the prophetic word came to Jeroboam, because when he received the prophetic word that God was going to give him 10 portions of the 12 tribes of Israel, it seems for a moment that he must have been favored in some way. But God saw what was in the man's heart. And then, of course, we have Rehoboam, and Rehoboam being the rightful heir. So what happened was that prophetically, Jeroboam was told that he would be given 10 tribes. And then when the day came when Rehoboam took the kingdom, he took the United Kingdom, and we have an incident involving the young men and the old men of the kingdom giving him advice. The young men, as young men do, advised that he should be a really tough king, and the old men told him to be more of a peacekeeper and a compromiser with the people to keep them on side. And Rehoboam took the advice of the young men of his own age, which is also very typical of not very wise young men. And Rehoboam famously said, "To your tents, Israel," and they turned in rebellion against the rightful king. And they went to the northern area where most of them lived. And that rebellion against Judah and Jerusalem went on for the next 300 years, although those in the southern kingdom of Judah who realized there was a need for rightful worship would invite them back, come and worship in Jerusalem. But by that time, they had built their own temple, Mount Gerizim. They had idols to worship. They were deep into idolatry, and they were changing worship and religion to suit themselves. So the divided kingdom, which sent 10 to the north and 2 to the south, even though those that had the access to the temple and had access to some religious Levites who returned to help them with temple worship, it wasn't just it wasn't a clear division of the tribes. They weren't sort of moving out in their serried ranks, by this time, the tribes had settled the hill countries, they'd settled the borderlands to the south and the north. And so they weren't sort of ranked in tribes. They came together in times of war. So, for example, the small tribe of Benjamin lived up on the borderland towards the north, and they could have easily gone to the north, but they remained with the south. They were a very, very small tribe, but they were also great warriors. And so some of the Levites stayed, some of Ephraim stayed in the south. And so it was a kind of ragged division, but it was a deep division where the vast majority went to the north. Okay, I don't know what happened there. So here we have a map, and maps are really useful. I know sometimes we look at a map and it's a bit like looking at maths, but have a look here. The blue is the kingdom of Israel, so far larger, and that is the north. And if you look up to the north, right up in the top corner, you see that the Assyrian Empire is right on their borders. So the strongest of their nation neighbors is right on their borders. And look at right in the middle of the northern kingdom, and what you see is Samaria. And that's important. Samaria, the Samaritans, and that should immediately bring to mind some of the stories from Jesus' time with the Samaritans, and helps you better understand the relationships between Judah and Samaria, the Samaritans, and the northern kingdom. And the reason that in the time of Jesus, the people from Samaria were regarded as worse than Gentiles, because what they had done is they had taken the religion and they had taken the promises. They'd taken prophets, they'd taken priests from the south, and the whole lot had been totally corrupted to fit the agenda of bad kings. And so from the perspective of the people who are in Judah, who preserved what they thought was rightful religion, those who lived in Samaria, the Samaritans, were completely corrupt and evil people. So if you look down to Judah, you see Jerusalem there at the top end, close to the northern kingdom. But then have a look at the coastline, the Mediterranean coastline, and at the very top you see Beirut, and at the bottom you see Gaza. If these nations had not been at war with one another for many millennia and destroying everything in sight, this land would have been some of the most magnificent, probably the most expensive real estate in the world, because it is a beautiful coastline, perfect climate, and all of that sort of thing. So there's Gaza, and the Bible has a great deal to say about Gaza, and there is a lot of suggestion that God cared for Gaza, or continues to care for the nations around Israel. But that's another day. Okay, I'm going to change slides, and I hope this goes quickly. I think it's my computer that's slow. Okay, so on this particular slide, I've tried to represent what happened to the kingdom through its division. So you've got Solomon at the top, and under Solomon you've got Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, in the big circle, he led the rebellion of the 10 lost tribes. And you could read that story in 1 Kings 11. The Samaritans had Mount Gerizim, they had their own worship, but they were the ones conquered by Assyria. So in the map, you see Assyria sitting at the top there, just waiting to pounce on them. So they had barely 300 years, a lot of kings in that time, and the kings just went from bad to worse. There's not much redemption there. These people were offered opportunities to go back and worship in Jerusalem, and that might have restored a bit of worship. But and a bit of understanding, because we're told that, they perish for a lack of understanding, for a lack of knowledge. And the minor prophets were constantly saying to them, return, return. And it was really return to God, return to the covenant. That's what is being said to them. And so the 10 tribes were lost. The fact that they were lost was debated in time, particularly in the 19th century, and particularly, of course, by the Mormons. And so the difficulty with that is that after the establishment of the Mormon Church and their texts and their understanding of what happened to the 10 tribes and that sort of thing, after they were established, there were many discoveries, not least of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was actually thousands upon thousands of fragments and many, many versions of the same text, such as the book of Isaiah. There were many versions of it that were recovered. And there were other documents discovered all over the Middle East through the technology of archaeology and through people's understanding, of where cities could be found and what sort of things might be found there, but knowing the historical context. And not only that, we developed a really good understanding of these languages of the ancient Near East, to the point that many scholars today could easily begin to read and translate texts that gave us a clear understanding of what happened, of who was deported and when they were deported, and the movement of those people over time. One of the things that happens when people move countries as refugees or through emigration is by the third generation, their social history has vanished, often along with their language and their understanding of their culture and their religion, except in those enclosed communities that carefully protect their religion. And the Jews, where the Jews maintained their tradition, their religion, and their practices, they certainly kept their language, and the children learned their religion. But that was not the case with the Northern Kingdom. They had left it all behind, and they had developed their own practices so that the people's affections would be focused elsewhere. So have a look at the other side, and we have Rehoboam there, and don't think for a moment that he was a godly man. You can read accounts of his life, and there was a prediction made around that time about a king by the name of Josiah who would appear and what he would do to the false prophets and priests. So Josiah's story is a beautiful story. He was king when Huldah was the prophetess in the college, which was in the wall of the temple. Her husband was the keeper of the wardrobe, and I presume they had some kind of apartment there. Huldah's wall still exists today in Jerusalem, and the area known as Huldah's Gate still exists. And so even though she gets a very small covering in the Bible, in Hebrew tradition, she is well known. Now, the thing about Huldah is that either she could read or she had enough prophetic knowledge and insight to be able to tell Josiah what God thought about the religion of Israel by the time, not Israel, but Judah, by the time Josiah was on the throne. Because the high priest had taken a copy of the text they'd found. They were cleaning up the temple, and they found the word of the Lord that had been created into a text of some kind, and gave it to the king. My personal theory is that it was hidden because there was always a possibility of siege. They were surrounded. The nation was surrounded by enemies. But as soon as Josiah understood what the word of the Lord was, he realized that they needed to repent, they needed to restore their feasts, they needed to restore worship and come back before God and begin to live like God's people. And so he led them in that. And once again, he wasn't always a perfectly good king. So the end of his life is very sticky because he didn't particularly listen to God at that time. And then we come down to Jehoiakim, who was a son of Josiah. He wasn't the original one on the throne. The second son, Jehoahaz, was actually made king, but Pharaoh Necho came down from Egypt and took him captive and left Jehoiakim there on the basis that Jehoiakim would pay tribute. And of course, that kept the Egyptians at bay for a while. But he was an evil and idolatrous king. He wasn't interested in religion at all. The last king that I've mentioned here is Zerubbabel. So even though the northern kingdom went into captivity very quickly into Assyria, the southern kingdom of Judah, it's actually Judah and Benjamin. They have the temple, they have Jerusalem, and they did have worship that pleased God for a short time. They went into captivity in waves, and basically they were taken captive by the Babylonians. The Babylonians were an enormous kingdom. They were a very sophisticated civilization. They were intellectual people. They were artistic. They had technology. And when they captured a nation, they were brutal to some extent, but they were very intent on keeping the people who had value. And so they left the poorest people in the land to work the land so that they get some return for it. And then they took the people who were the scribes, the teachers, the prophets, the seers, and the kings and the young men, and they took them all into Babylon. And even though these people were in captivity, they served the king, and you can read things about that, stories about that in the book of Daniel and in other places. And the time came when the Babylonian kingdom actually fell. And it fell almost by accident. There was a battle in which Cyrus of Persia happened to come out on top, which enabled him to walk into the kingdom and take control. Now, Cyrus did not have the kingdom for very long. He had it for about 5 minutes. And he himself didn't last very long. And he was the one that gave the order for the restoration of Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel was the king that was sent back to do the work. It didn't happen overnight. It took many, many years. It actually took decades. And the reason for that is people didn't want to go back. They were comfortable where they were. And it was just like, when Israel was in captivity in Egypt before the kingdom was even established, they were comfortable in captivity. They were comfortable in the narrow place. Egypt itself is referred to by a word that means the narrow place. The narrow place is also like a narrow bed. It might restrict you, but it's also comfortable. And so the people in Babylon didn't really want to return to Jerusalem, and it was quite an effort. And you, of course, can read about that in the book of Nehemiah, in Haggai, Ezekiel. There's lots referring to that period of time. So I hope by giving you this overview that you can see the integration of a lot of different topics, and you sort of need to go and, instead of reading your Bible from Genesis to Revelation, you might actually have to make searches around to find the scriptures you need to get the fullness of the story. Okay, so here's an overview of the prophets, the minor prophets. So those who prophesied the fall of the north: Hosea, who came from the northern kingdom; Hosea, Joel, Obadiah, Micah, and Amos, who came from Tekoa, near Bethlehem in Judea. Okay, so Judea or Judah. So Bethlehem, even though it was right, it was sort of, it could have straddled various places, but it was part of the south. And so Amos went down to the north and told them what they should be doing. Okay, those who prophesied the fall of the south, which is Judah and Jerusalem, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. To some extent, all of them gave hope of return, but those who prophesied the return of the exiles, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then we have an odd one. We have Jonah, who prophesied to Nineveh in Assyria. So remember Assyria, the enemy? And yet there was some fragment of religion there that they could repent. And that in itself is another story. Okay. So the lost tribes of the northern kingdom, the Samaritans, Samaria, may represent a remnant. They had 20 kings in 350 years. They were taken into captivity about 722 BC. So remember, because it's BC, the numbers kind of go backwards from there until we get to 400 BC, where the silence, the prophetic silence begins before Jesus' first coming. They were never released, and those who remained intermarried pagans. So some people could have been left in the land, some could have moved into the land. And once again, it was not about kind of serried ranks of tribes. It was clusters of families and people who had themselves intermarried, so that the tribes were already intermarried before they were taken into captivity. Most important for us are the tribes that returned to Jerusalem. So 70 years of captivity had left most of the Hebrew people with no memory of where they came from, but their religion and culture were intact, and they had prophetic promises. So there were many things that they were holding onto as a community, and they were recognized as a community even in Babylon. And so when Babylon fell to the Persians actually had almost no capacity to oppress a people. They were not as sophisticated a culture as any of the other nations around. They became very great, but they were still living in the hill countries at that stage. And their victory was almost accidental, as I've said. So they didn't have much use for these Jewish people. They didn't have much use for their gods. And so they started to decide to send them back to where they had come from, and also deprive Babylon the benefit of this intellectual class, this artisan class of people. The Jewish people, although they had a strong community which had a powerful culture, their family life had remained intact, their religion and parts of their language that were used devotionally. They were speaking other languages. You read that in the book of Nehemiah, where Ezra had to make sure that there were translators for the people so they could even understand what was going on. But they were in no hurry to go back to Jerusalem. And that's typical of all migrant groups once they settle in a country. So the narrow place, Egypt was called the narrow place, like a narrow bed that can be both restrictive but also warm and comfortable. And Egypt itself was referred to in those terms by the first tribes that went there as hungry shepherds, and then went into captivity as slaves to the Egyptians. And so they didn't want to leave Egypt, and these people didn't basically want to leave Babylon either, because they were too comfortable. And that's true of all of us. It's a great spiritual lesson. So the Babylonians had left the poorest in the land and taken all of the others, and these other people were the ones that now had to go back. Babylonian captivity had been very important for them. They had received a real education while they were in Babylon. Despite the hardships of being basically a slave race in Babylon, they had learned languages, but they had translated their scriptures. So because Josiah had been on the throne, Huldah had been a prophet in Jerusalem at that time, and Jeremiah was the nephew of Huldah. A lot of things had begun to unfold for them, particularly the recording of messages, the recording of the word of God, the promises of God, the prophetic promises, the hope, all of that. we have minor prophets that recorded a small amount of their work. They obviously said a lot more than was recorded. But then we have people like Jeremiah and his huge works. And he obviously was a writing prophet. God told him to write. And there were a lot of writing prophets that were developing at the same time as him. But once they were in Babylon, the Jewish people understood that they needed their scriptures. They needed God's eternal word to them as his chosen people, as his covenant people. And so the writing of scriptures began in earnest. The preservation of scribal works, the education of scribes, all of that went ahead full steam. And it was such an important thing that some a couple of 100 years later, when they were building a great library in Alexandria, they knew the library would be incomplete without Jewish documents. And so out of that decision, the Septuagint came into being. Now, the Septuagint is still regarded as the most reliable Greek language source of Hebrew texts. It was written by 70 scholars. We're even told that they came from all 12 tribes, but that may not be correct. That might be part of the myth. Or maybe they were able to find enough people from different tribes for the occasion. I don't know. But the people who were scribes, they were a particular class of people, and they were from specific tribes also. But anyway, they had 70 Hebrew scholars that put together the Septuagint, and they basically had a canon of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, which is the whole of the text, as separate from the Torah, which is the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so they completed the whole work. There were additional books that are not used in Protestant circles, but are kept by Jewish and some Eastern traditions. But that wasn't what happened actually in Babylon. That happened after Babylon, and that could never have happened if in Babylon they hadn't recognized the incredible importance of writing down their history, their prophecies, their promises, and their covenant. And so we have a picture actually of two captivities. One, the northern tribes that were in rebellion, who established their own religion and were lost to all time. And then we have Judah. And the importance of this is that the Jewish people are probably, I'm certain, the only people in the world who survived for thousands of years and were able to be restored to their homeland with their language, their religion, and their culture intact, with a cultural memory that went back eons. Nothing like it has ever happened in the history of humanity, and it began in their captivity in Judah. Sorry, their captivity in Babylon and their final return to Judah. So rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. That was to come 400 years later, but I'm going to finish this presentation right here, and hope that you'll be able to do some of the Bible reading into the background and get the idea of the division of the kingdom and the judgment and exile of the kingdom and the restoration of Judah. Try and get them in your mind, get them clearly in your mind before we dive deeply into the minor prophets. Thank you.